Hello again, welcome back to the final show of the week. I'm going to talk about documentaries that are kind of entertainment based, like into the arts and things like that. A whole bunch of them I've watched, so I just clumped them in one video. Starting trying to spread them out over a bunch of videos. I'm just doing one video, kind of explain them all because I think it'll be easy. I'm not sure, I think some of them I don't have that much to say about them beyond I've enjoyed what we watch. I'm going to start with You Don't Know Me, which is a film about Showgirls, the famous Paul Verhoeven disaster from the mid-90s, which is now a cult film. Verhoeven, even when he messes up, can't make a boring film. So, you know, it's two kind of really notorious films that got the country was in hating him. Was Spetters in the Netherlands when he was in the middle of his European phase, which, because it showed like homophobia and male rape and stuff, you know, the people there did not like that. They did not like and have seen the problems on a film, and then they just accused him of being homophobic when he was actually had one of his main characters be gay, and it was like, there's just people complaining. Spetters is a good film. It's flawed, but it's good. And then you'd Showgirls, and this one got absolutely hated, and this one was loathed, and obviously I'm going to do a video on it eventually, but I'm waiting for a little bit longer. But this documentary talks about why it became a cult film, what happened in the production, what are the different theories about it, what are the flaws on it, what's the strengths of it. I mean, one of the big things about it is it's thought of as a cult classic, it's a camp classic because everything's over the top. And that was kind of intentional because Verhoeven actually directed the actor to be a bit over the top. Because he knew he was doing a melodrama, and he understood the script was ridiculous and he was trying to do something and it came off really weird. And which is why the film lasts, because it's so cynical about America and the idea of how you get ahead in America. It was so cynical about that, and it was intentionally campy, intentionally over the top. I was trying to be musical about stuff that most people in America didn't want to see, like nudity and things like that. And I think Verhoeven was throwing in so much weirdness into this one film that you're either going to love or hate it. And I'm kind of in between Showgirls. I like Showgirls, an interesting thing, but there's some stuff in Showgirls that are hard to watch because Verhoeven went too far, you know. But Verhoeven going too far is always interesting, so even his flaws are fascinating. So You Don't Know Me is definitely worth seeing. It's really enjoyable because you see people who know the film's flawed but who love it anyway, and you can see how it's affected people and how they've embraced it. And it's kind of funny because this is a film that bombed that time and now is got a cult following. And there's lots of films that came out at that time that no one watches anymore that got good reviews. It's like, nah, who cares? It's boring, you know. So sometimes it's better to be infamous than to be famous at the time. Infamous lasts longer. Okay, now we're going to talk about Inmate Number 1, The Rise of Danny Trejo. This is a documentary about Danny Trejo from his time as a youth, being in prison, being in hard prison, to how he rose up beyond that and became a social worker and then eventually an actor. Because he's had quite a career and not all of it to public. So he started off as a young person with a family who were trying to work hard, but Trejo got under the wing of his uncle, who was a drug addict and a criminal. And Trejo, because he came from a broken family, fell under that and was trying heroin by the time he was 12, you know, was a petty criminal, and really pushed everyone away that tried to help him, and ended up in prison for a long time and having to, you know, survive in there. And he actually discusses how he survived in prison, how you learned the ropes, how to be tough in prison, how to look tough so the predators won't come for you. And amazing how he turned his life around, realising this was not the way to live a life. So when he got out, after he'd been boxing for a while, because he learned how to box in prison, he was a good boxer, he found ways to make his life better. Eventually, when he came out of prison, he was he decided to turn his life around, take a bad job to start with, like was a bin man or something, just to not go back to criminal life. And he rejected all the attempts by his uncle and other people to bring him back into criminal life, and just said, no, I'm not doing that, I'm doing this. And eventually became a social worker and try to help people who are in the same situation as him to choose the right path and not fall into crime. And even now, basically, even though he's an actor, it's about how he still goes to prisons wherever he is and tries to talk to the inmates and tries to help them find a better way so they don't see criminality as the way out of anything. It's like, how do you actually survive? And it's also saying, look, these are the mistakes I made. Like, we all make mistakes. So a very humanistic story about a guy trying to turn around his errors and the things he knew he did wrong when he was young and he still feels guilty about, and try to make something positive with it. So he always goes into the idea of how he became an actor, which was, he was an extra. He got work as an extra on a prison film, and Eddie Bunker, who was a criminal who became a writer, recognised him. He said, hey, you're Danny Trejo. And so he got a part as a boxer on, I think it was Runaway Train. And then he slowly started to get work as criminals in films, and then slowly worked his way up to get other kind of parts, like when Robert Rodriguez gave him like good guy parts and stuff like that, and eventually slowly built up a career through starting off as the baddies and then slowly became the good guys at times. But he still does some villains. But his idea is, he does that for a living. Some films are good, some are not so good, but he also spends a lot of his time going to still being a social worker and actually going to prisons and helping people that have difficulties, and bringing his money back into his community and try and build up his community so that people feel in the community that there's hope. So it's a very interesting film. It's definitely worth seeing. It's unusual to see an actor be that selfless, to be honest, because we know most of them aren't. Now we've got Hollywood Banker, which is the story of a guy who basically was a banker in the Netherlands for a long time, which was a bank also in France, where he started in the Netherlands, went to France, and this is a banker who ran the loans for a lot of production companies in the 70s and 80s and 90s that allowed like production companies like Carolco and Canon to make their films. They gave them loans and got their money back and worked with them to make sure that they could talk to different distributors so they could arrange pre-sales so that whenever they made the film they were guaranteed to get the money back if they sold the film. And he was a guy for over like 20 years, worked this way and developed a system of pre-sales that helped a lot of production companies do a lot of films. So it's about this guy basically, who's now died, but at the time he was big. And so he started off with Dino De Laurentiis, because Dino needed money always for his films, and Dino showed him the ropes of how to survive in the film industry. Then he went off to then they went to deal with Superman and all its problems with financing, because it turns out they'd loaned the Salkins a lot of money and no one was quite sure what had happened, how all these loans had come through, and then he was brought in to try and make sense of it all. And then slowly after that he started to make a living doing this through his banks and be building up his own area within the bank to actually do this and actually make a profit for the banks while doing this, and also allowing a lot of production companies to make their films and then pay them back. And also he was a person, he knew all the distributors, so he knew how to introduce people to distributors who may be able to make deals. And also if there was a problem between the distributor and the production company, he could go in and be like the arbitrator for it and just say, look, to try and make a deal so that everyone get paid. So he did a lot, and for 20 years he was working a lot. He ended up going to Hollywood after a while because he was so big that he needed to be there to get the deals made. And so he started off in the Netherlands, then went to France, then went to Hollywood, and eventually everything collapsed and came back to France. It's just interesting to look at how the film business worked and how the film business expanded. So Carrico, who made a lot of big films like Terminator 2 and the Rambo films in the 80s, they're covered. Paul Verhoeven's in it. He was covered because he was with Carrico for a while, from like Total Recall, Basic Instinct and Showgirls. So he became friends with the guy. And it's just a story about the guy and how the independent film industry worked in that time, even though it doesn't work that way anymore. So it's really interesting to look at how things were financed and how difficult it could be, but how kind of it became a system, but how it was also open to abuse by certain bankers and distributors who would back the wrong films or would find ways to hide a lot of debt within that system. So it became like how it kind of get corrupted and how appalled he was when it started to get corrupted, you know, because he built up a system that would help everybody, and then human nature just destroyed it, obviously, as people get greedy, as like Canon films suddenly broke away from him at a certain point, and then they collapsed soon after, because I think he told them to keep within the lane and they didn't do that. And there was lots of stuff like that, and it's really interesting documentary. Not for everybody though, because it's about a kind of system that not everyone's interested in, but it is interesting to me. And now I'm going to talk about the life and ghastly death of Al Adamson, which is a documentary about the filmmaker Al Adamson, who made a lot of bad films. I mean, and they go through the whole thing about how cheap he was, like how did he started, how he brought people on who would make a lot of films with him. Some of them would write them, some of them would be production designers for it, and just how cheap he was, and how these films, a lot of time, were like 3 films stuck into one, or they would reshoot massive parts of the film after they shot it because the market had changed, so suddenly they could exploit something else. And it was just about the low budget, the lowest of the low budget exploitation stuff in the 70s, 60s, 70s and early 80s, and how this guy made a profit while making lots of bad films that no one would want to watch. Because I mean, this guy was notorious for making bad films. I mean, he'd get Russ Tamblyn and a few of them for a while because Russ Tamblyn needed the money. And he got a lot of friends to write stuff cheap for him and do stuff cheap for him, and the joke was he was so cheap, he just wouldn't pay for anything. So it's all about this story of this guy, how he made his film, and then the market collapsed and he wasn't making films anymore. But you got to know a lot of his cohorts, his producer, who seemed crazy as hell. For this documentary at least, he seemed crazy. I don't know what he's like in real life, but the documentary, he came across as a bit crazy. I know a bunch of other people, some of them saying like, the guy never made a good film in his life, but we get paid ish, you know, and it was fun. You know, it was like they knew what the films were making. Eventually get into UFO conspiracies, but the really darker side was he was happily married for a while, and then his wife died of cancer, and that actually just spin him off, where he ended up going with this other woman, and it seemed to be starting working for them, and then suddenly he took on this guy who is a worker for him, and he was a guy who did construction work for him, and this guy seemed very sketchy, and they seemed to be stealing from him, and then they fired him, and then he brought him back, and at some point this guy murdered him, and that's where it gets really dark, obviously. And it's about the kind of weird psychology of this guy who had done all this stuff in his life, and then suddenly he fell in with the wrong person and his life ended. And he seemed to be a guy who had gone through rough times, he was starting to come back out of it, and then tragedy struck for him. And it's like, it's kind of a sad story because he seemed to be getting back to what he wanted to be, and then he ran into this psycho who had no cares about who he was. This guy wanted his money and would do anything to get his money, and it's just a tragic tale. But the actual documentary is fun to watch, to look at the exploitation world and how seedy it can be, and how awful the films could be, they can still make a profit, even though they were just even from the clips you see, it's like, I don't want to watch this. And they'd scenes of films that starred like Lon Chaney Jr. while he was riddled with cancer and drunk, and a bunch of other old veterans who basically could barely walk anymore because they were so old, and that guy was exploiting them. So it was about the serious side of that, but it was also about the fun side of making those films, but also the dark side of that life as it went on. So it's a very interesting documentary. It's definitely worth seeing. Now we have two different documentaries about egotism and within the arts. We've got The Madness and Method of Jerry Lewis and Once Were Brothers with all about Robert Robertson. Now, there's a big difference between these two films. Both are tied to Martin Scorsese, and Scorsese produced Once Were Brothers. But the difference between the films are night and day. Basically, the Jerry Lewis one from 2010, before he died, was about his process and how he, it kind of avoided certain things, like why him and Dean Martin broke up. And it did show he had an ego. No one denied that, even him. But it also showed you why he did what he did, and showed you how he was brought up, how he's always a showbiz kid straight away because his family was showbiz, how he learned the craft, and how a lot of stuff he did was basically craftsmanship and learning stuff, and how he was hyper focused on what he was doing. And he was trying to work stuff out, and he was always he was a gag man basically. The films were not about what was the subject of the films. The film was about how do you get a subject to get enough gags in it. So he was an entertainer more than anything else. And it's all about the methodology of Jerry Lewis trying to be entertaining. Starting off just being vaudeville basically, or a post-vaudeville situation with his father. Then after the war, basically just working at clubs. Then joined up with Dean Martin, where they founded a really good combination. They just got on, and how they worked for 10 years together and just did this act that everyone loved and made films together. They had a weird chemistry that everyone loved, and they just enjoyed each other's company. That broke up, and then Jerry Lewis became Jerry Lewis and made stuff like Nutty Professor and things, where he was the guy directing it and orchestrating it, and he was like getting sets built to specifications. But the thing with Lewis was he actually was making films. He was building all this stuff for gags he'd worked out, and you see him was working hard on the gags and doing take after take, retake, and making sure the gag worked, making sure the setup worked, and he would invest money in the films if no one believed in them. So he wanted to make the film work for him and for an audience. I mean, he understood that. It was basically in his bones. Like, make a joke, make it work, get the next joke working, then the next, work with people who know what they're doing, and keep a lot of technicians who understood how he worked, so that he could always proceed with, clarity, and keep working and keep making these films. So for a while that worked for him, and then eventually went out of fashion, But for a long time he was a big star, and he was making films that a lot of people liked. Not the most highbrow films, not the films that were loved by the critics, but the audiences liked him, and he was a professional and he did what he did. And it goes into later on, he did kind of comedy with Scorsese. He was revered for that, and he said it was just a job. Which I quite liked that attitude, like it was just a job, it wasn't really a big deal. And just a different type of job. And it's kind of a likeable look at his career. It doesn't feel like it's trying to ignore the downsides, that he's a workaholic. He could be hard to get on with because he had a certain mindset, but it's kind of explaining the mindset behind him rather than trying to say, oh, he's misunderstood. It's like, no, he does a certain mindset. Then he did the telethons to get money for people in need and stuff like that. So it covers a lot of stuff, and it covers his later career where he's still kind of a machine, basically going around the country and doing shows because that's what he was trained for. That's what gave his life purpose. So no matter what scale it was on, he still needed to do that. So it's a very interesting look at a career that's is what it is. It's not trying to say it's anything different. It is what it is. The Once Were Brothers Robbie Robertson one is something rather different. This is full ego. This is a kind of documentary. It was produced by Scorsese. It's a documentary I do not believe half the stuff in it. I just do not believe it. I just think it's self-serving nonsense half the time. Because it's always from one person's point of view. It's not explaining the mechanism the Jerry Lewis one did. It's a point of view of, this is how my life went, and this is how all these controversial things happened, or controversial music things happened. But it doesn't explain why certain band members hated him, or a lot of the problems. And he seems to do an amazing job in self-sabotaging his own arguments throughout it. So it's about Robbie Robertson talking about his life before the band, before he became a member of the band, how he was into music, how he, started working with Ronnie Hawkins when he was youngster, came in to that band, but Lee Von Helm was already there, and brought in other people to the band as well, who became the band, basically. And then they moved on from Ronnie Hawkins. Now, according to other people, Robbie Robertson got rid of Ronnie Hawkins because he didn't like the music. That's not covered in this documentary. It's like, oh no, he's always the most loyal person ever, type of thing. And there's other people saying, no, he wasn't. So that's a hint that this might not be as honest as it's projecting itself. And another thing you want to remember is, Robbie Robertson is one of the most pretentious people talking ever. When you listen to talk in this documentary, you feel it put your foot through the TV half the time because he's so pretentious. He is like David St. Hubbins from Spinal Tap, dialed up even worse. I mean, every time he talks, you can kind of see Michael McKean doing a Spinal Tap voice. You can't see him saying lines like "Cosby in my life is a total shambles." He's that kind of pretentious. And he's very annoying to listen to a lot of the time. But the documentary has a lot of good footage of the band when they were young. It's just really interesting. The subject's interesting, it's just the person telling the story isn't. And most of the other people are dead. And so it is kind of annoying to watch at times. So the film keeps going on, talking about the band, how they grew together, how they end up working with Bob Dylan when Bob Dylan went from basically being a country singer or a kind of folk singer to using electric guitar. And they were the band they was with at the time, so they got a lot of the abuse. And Lee Van Helm left at some point because he just think, why am I doing this to get all this abuse? Eventually, after that tour, they start writing some songs together, with Dylan and without Dylan. Helm comes back, and after the Basement tapes, they do the first album in the concept of the band. Very pretentious name, isn't it? The band. We are the band. And it gets a lot of critical acclaim. And they keep doing stuff. They keep making songs that are well received. They eventually tour again after one of the members has a serious car crash, and then a lot of the band get into heroin and drink, and the bad boys, well, Robbie becomes a family man, so he's going in one direction, they're going in another direction. And this is where the film really is annoying, because it's like, even if you don't even do any reading about it, it's so obvious from one person's point of view, and that person thinks lying to make themselves look good, that it doesn't even remotely tie into what you know of life. And that's the problem with this film. It never ties into life in any interesting way. It always feels like you're told a story with someone who's trying to cover their tracks and doing it badly. Because yeah, they say about all the drug abuse and stuff, and how the later songs, Robbie had to write a lot of them alone, blah 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 blah. And then then eventually say, oh, they broke up, the band then broke up and did the last waltz, and they went on, did their own thing. Historically, that's bollocks. Because the band got back together not long after, and kept working together. They also did individual projects as well, but they all got back together apart from Robbie. They did not bring him back. See why there's a difference. And they admitted they had a drug problem in the 70s. They were up front. Leaving Helm was actually saying to say they didn't have one would be absurd. They were up front about it. One of the members, Richard Manuel, died in the 80s, you know, of an overdose. It's public knowledge, you know. So it just feels like that this whole documentary is trying to make Robbie look like a saint compared to all these other dirty members of the band who ruined his genius. But the absurd thing is, since then, where did people know Robbie Williams from? He's Martin Scorsese's pal. Basically does some tracks for some of his albums, for some of his films sometimes. I don't know him apart from that. You know. And then there was a lawsuit between Lee Van Helm and Robbie Robertson about the royalties from the publishing rights, because Robertson said, I wrote the lyrics, so I wrote the songs, basically. And this film shows you how they wrote the songs. Was he would write some lyrics and then they would start to work on it, and it would be a much more developed process where it wasn't just about the lyrics. I mean, if you listen to any of this band stuff, the lyrics are the least part of it in some ways. It's the way the music flows, and it was like, and I'm with the middle name of the band in this one. I think in these songs specifically, the lyrics are as important as the orchestrations. And he was saying orchestration is just part of the job if you're a member of the band, so you don't get royalties. Well, so are the lyrics, really. And it makes you really, the pretension, the basic sense that he's not telling the full truth. He keeps on shooting himself in the foot with this argument, because he keeps on showing footage of the band working the songs out. But he's come up with some lyrics, but never working the songs out into tunes. And it's an organic thing. He seems to think that we were brothers and we did this organically. Then he says, I'm not giving you money for these musical rights. Why? Because he wants the money himself. You know, and it's like, well, if you're a band, you should be sharing the music rights, because some of you wrote the lyrics, some of you wrote the different orchestrations. It's still writing the thing. You're still doing that thing. I mean, it's like, it's not like a director who planned everything out and had people do certain things. This is like a band organically working off each other and playing off each other, so that it couldn't be made without anybody. It had to be made with a whole bunch of people, and everyone had a kind of say in it. So that's why it becomes a really strange thing, because he didn't show it like it was like the Beatles seemed to do a lot of time, where they'd go off and write their own songs and come back in and see, this is how we do it. This is like, I'm showing that we worked as a band and we experimented a lot and tried different things. And it's like, well, you just destroy your own argument, because then you're saying, oh, I need the publishing rights because I wrote the lyrics. And it's like, so I'm a team leader on this one. He was sued for this, and I'm not sure if he won a loss, but he hated Robertson so much he refused to go to the Hall of Fame thing when they put it in the Hall of Fame, because Robertson was going to be there. That's how much he hated Robertson by the end of it. You know, because... And the band kept on working without him. And this documentary doesn't say that. This documentary says it was over once we finished. It's like, there's mass evidence to say that wasn't the case. It's like, the whole documentary is so pretentious and so up itself. I mean, the funny thing is, I thought I'd been watching the Jerry Lewis documentary thinking, it's a load of bollocks, and turns out it was the musical one, the one about the band. I thought it was a load of bollocks. The Jerry Lewis one was insane. So, as that was kind of interesting. The final one I'm talking about is Dreams with Sharp Teeth, which is by Harlan Ellison, who's a writer, sci-fi writer, bit of a big mouth, who died a while ago. This was a very controversial figure, because he liked writing about sex and all the rest of it, and he was very left-wing, very left-leaning, very argumentative. He'd sue anybody, and he became more famous for his personality more than his writing after a while, really. And that's a documentary about him and his beliefs, about how he brought up, how he became who he was. It was kind of interesting, because he came across as likeable, but, you know, not the guy getting the wrong side of. But like the Robbie Robertson thing, sometimes there's some self-aggrandizing that is kind of annoying. In this case, they should have said to the directors, look, that's not factually accurate. Like, there's this both thing about, in it, we're talking about the 60s and how important Ellison was to sci-fi. Well, it was a short story writer and a guy who wrote for TV and films. A lot of the real sci-fi work was getting done in Britain with New World, with Michael Moorcock, with J.G. Ballard, all that stuff, where Harlan Ellison wrote for. They were one of his employers. And they were writing stuff that was much more outrageous and much more like demanding on the audience and much more like brutalising to the power structures while getting money from a government grant while they're doing it. They were so much more worse. They were such darker. They were so much more important to sci-fi than Harlan Ellison ever was. And they're never mentioned, and it's like, if you're talking about the 60s and you don't mention that to sci-fi, what the hell are you talking about? This is just ridiculous. And that's the thing that really bugged me in the documentaries. They didn't mention all those writers from there because they were important. Because as soon as you mention like J.D. Ballard, Harlan Ellison looks like second rate in comparison, because compared to J.D. Ballard, Harlan Ellison is not a great writer. You know. And it's just a case of fandom. They're anti-fandom, like, this is our great American writer because he was better than the rest of the American writers. Yeah, but most of the British writers were better in this field. I mean, Arthur C. Clarke was more important. You know, he was a much old-fashioned guy. Michael Moorcock was more important. J.G. Ballard was really more important. Brian Aldiss. For that field, and most of the writers who could not get published in America were published by New Worlds in Britain. So it was that documentary really annoyed me. I know it sounds like that's the main part, but it's not. But it's that's the kind of problem the documentary has, where it doesn't really do research into the field it's talking about and takes whatever Ellison says as fact. And a much more probing documentary would still be very sympathetic towards him because he was a good writer and he did a lot of good stuff. But he wasn't the greatest writer. He was a good writer in a field that had some great writers. You know, and he was more famous for his comments than he was for a lot of his fiction. So it's like, it's a weird situation where the fans are trying to rewrite history with Ellison's help in a weird way before he died, and it's, I just don't buy it. I just think he had his place, but his place was not at the highest level. It was near the high level, but not quite the highest level. And then an honest documentary would have had that, and we would have actually have been honest. If they'd been honest about his place in the field, it could have been a really moving documentary because there's a guy who'd accomplished a lot. But it was a field where a lot of people accomplished a lot as well. So it's like, it just feels like it's not quite, it didn't feel honest. It kind of like the Whisper Brothers, it didn't feel honest for what it was talking about. It just felt like it was sentimental. And it was a younger director, not calling bullshit an older guy. You know. So, but it's still worth watching. It's actually a lot more fun than the Robbie Robertson one because you've got Harlan Ellison, who's a much more fun character and who's way more entertaining. He's wrong a lot about what stuff he says, but he's entertaining. I mean, because at least he's not a pretentious douche like Robbie Robertson comes across as in his documentary. But yeah, these are all the stuff I watched, all the different documentaries about the arts that I watched. I hope you enjoyed this video. I'll be back next week with some more videos, but that's me for this week. Well, I'll see you later.